A study published in the Journal of Business Ethics found that 1 in 5 senior corporate executives meets the clinical criteria for psychopathy. Not 1 in 100, 1 in 5. They weren't in prison. They weren't in a psychiatric ward. They were running companies, managing teams, making decisions that affected thousands of people, and they were doing it without the capacity for remorse. But here's the part nobody talks about. Psychopathy is only one of the 3 traits, and the other 2 are just as dangerous. Together they form what psychologists call the Dark Triad. And once you understand what it is, you'll never look at people the same way again. In 2002, 2 psychologists at the University of British Columbia, Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams, published a paper that would change how we study human behavior. They had been studying personality disorders separately for years: narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. 3 distinct traits, 3 different fields of research. But when they looked at the data together, they noticed something disturbing. The 3 traits clustered. People who scored high in one almost always scored elevated in the others. And when all 3 appeared together in the same person, the results were unlike anything else in the psychological literature. They named the combination the Dark Triad. Not because these people are villains in a movie, but because each of these 3 traits on its own describes someone who is fundamentally oriented toward their own interests at the expense of everyone around them. And here's the question that researchers have been trying to answer ever since. Are these people born this way, or are they made? That's what this video is about. We're going to break down each of the 3 traits, what they actually mean, what they look like in real people, how they develop, and what science says about whether they can be changed. Let's start at the beginning. The word narcissism comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus, a young man so beautiful that he fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring at it. We use the word casually. He's such a narcissist. She's obsessed with herself. But clinical narcissism, the kind that belongs in the Dark Triad, is something very different from vanity or self-confidence. Psychologists define narcissistic personality disorder by 3 core features: grandiosity, an inflated, often delusional sense of one's own importance. Not just "I'm good at my job," more like "I am exceptional. The rules that apply to ordinary people don't apply to me." Entitlement, the belief that you deserve special treatment, and genuine outrage when you don't receive it. The narcissist doesn't experience this as arrogance, they experience it as justice. And lack of empathy, not the inability to understand how others feel. Narcissists can be remarkably skilled at reading emotions, the inability to care. Others' feelings are relevant only insofar as they affect the narcissist's agenda. Here's what makes narcissism particularly insidious in the Dark Triad context. Narcissists are often magnetic. They project confidence. They tell compelling stories about their own importance. In early interactions, they can seem like exactly the kind of person you want to know. Research by Nicholas Holtzman at Washington University found that narcissists are consistently rated as more attractive and likable in first impressions, but that rating reverses sharply after extended contact. The charm is real, it's just instrumental. If narcissism is about needing to be special, psychopathy is about something deeper and more disturbing: the absence of conscience. The psychologist Robert Hare spent decades studying incarcerated criminals at British Columbia Penitentiary. What he found, and what he eventually codified in his Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR, was a personality structure unlike any other in clinical psychology. The PCLR measures 20 traits across 2 broad factors. Factor 1 captures what Hare called the interpersonal and affective features: superficial charm, grandiose self-worth, pathological lying, cunning and manipulation, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness, and failure to accept responsibility. Factor 2 covers the socially deviant lifestyle, need for stimulation, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral control, early behavioral problems, impulsivity, irresponsibility, juvenile delinquency. The average person scores between 3 and 5 on the PCLR. A score above 30 out of 40 is considered diagnostic for psychopathy. Ted Bundy, when assessed posthumously through available records, estimated in the 35-38 range. But here's the critical distinction that most people miss. Not all psychopaths are violent. In fact, the majority are not. The term successful psychopath was coined by researchers to describe individuals who score high on the PCLR, but function within, and often thrive within, conventional society. Their lack of anxiety makes them calm under pressure. Their willingness to exploit others makes them aggressive negotiators. Their absence of guilt allows them to make decisions that emotionally wired people could never make. They don't end up in prison, they end up in corner offices. The third trait is named after a man who died 500 years ago. Niccolo Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat and political philosopher who, in 1513, wrote a small book called The Prince. It was a guide for rulers, and it was unlike anything that had come before. Most political philosophy of the time was concerned with how leaders should behave. Machiavelli wasn't interested in that question. He wanted to know how leaders who survive actually behave. His conclusion: the most effective rulers are those who understand that power is immoral, that deception and manipulation are not vices to be avoided, they are tools to be mastered. In psychological terms, Machiavellianism refers to a disposition towards strategic manipulation, a willingness to use deception, and a fundamentally cynical view of human nature. The Machiavellian person doesn't hate you. They don't feel contempt for you. They simply see you as a variable in a calculation they are always running. What distinguishes Machiavellianism from psychopathy is patience, where the psychopath acts on impulse, driven by sensation-seeking, and low behavioral control. The Machiavellian plays the long game. They are willing to pretend, to be charming, to wait years for the right moment. They are not driven by the absence of emotion like the psychopath. They are driven by a cold, deliberate suppression of it. Researchers Christie and Gase, who first operationalized Machiavellianism as a psychological construct in 1970, described it as a personality orientation, characterized by detachment from conventional morality, a cool, unemotional approach to interpersonal relations, and a willingness to engage in manipulation to achieve personal goals. When you combine this with narcissism's entitlement and psychopathy's absence of conscience, you begin to understand why the Dark Triad is considered one of the most dangerous personality clusters in psychology. Now we get to the question at the center of all of this. Are Dark Triad individuals born that way, or does something create them? The honest answer is both, but the proportions matter. Twin studies, the gold standard for separating genetic from environmental influences, have consistently found that psychopathy is approximately 50% heritable, meaning roughly half of the variance in psychopathic traits is explained by genetic factors. Narcissism shows similar heritability estimates, ranging from 45% to 64% depending on the study. But genetics don't work in isolation. What researchers have found is a diathesis stress model. The genetic predisposition creates a vulnerability, and environmental factors determine whether that vulnerability becomes fully expressed. The environmental factors that consistently emerge in the literature: severe early childhood trauma, emotional neglect, inconsistent or absent parenting, and, critically, environments that rewarded Dark Triad behaviors. Here's the part that challenges our intuitions. It's not just bad environments that produce Dark Triad adults. Research by Glenn, Iyer, Graham, Koleva, and Haidt found that some environments, particularly highly competitive ones, that reward ruthlessness, select for Dark Triad traits even in individuals who didn't start with unusually high predispositions. In other words, certain systems don't just tolerate these traits, they cultivate them. The implication is uncomfortable. Understanding the Dark Triad theoretically is one thing. Recognizing it in real life is another. Researchers have identified several behavioral markers that appear consistently across all three traits. Rapid intimacy escalation. Dark Triad individuals, particularly narcissists and psychopaths, often move very fast in new relationships. They create a sense of immediate closeness that feels unusually intense. This is not genuine connection. It's a technique called love bombing, a deliberate strategy to establish emotional leverage before the target's defenses are calibrated. Reaction to criticism, a reliable test. Dark Triad individuals respond to criticism with one of two patterns: explosive anger, the narcissistic injury response, or cold, calculated counterattack. What they almost never display is genuine reflection or accountability. The history of others. Pay attention to how Dark Triad individuals describe their past relationships. Former partners are always villains. Former employers are always incompetent. Former friends always betrayed them. The pattern of everyone else being wrong, and only they being wronged, is a diagnostic signal. Inconsistency between public and private behavior. The person who is charming, generous, and warm in public, but contemptuous, controlling, and cold in private, is not a contradiction. It's a performance. The public persona is designed, the private one is real. Can a Dark Triad individual change? The research is not optimistic, but it's not hopeless. For psychopathy, the evidence for therapeutic change is weak. Traditional talk therapy, designed for people who experience emotional pain and want relief from it, has limited effect on individuals who don't experience their own traits as distressing. Some researchers have found that behavioral interventions, not focused on insight or empathy development, but on teaching concrete behavioral alternatives, show modest results in reducing antisocial behavior, particularly in adolescents. For narcissism, the picture is slightly more nuanced. Schema therapy and mentalization-based treatment have shown some promise. The prerequisite, and it's a significant one, is that the individual must experience enough cost from their behavior to be motivated to change. Most Dark Triad individuals don't reach that threshold. Their traits help them succeed by conventional metrics. They don't feel broken, they feel strategic. What the research does support is protective awareness. The more clearly you understand how the Dark Triad operates, the harder it becomes for those traits to operate on you. Niccolo Machiavelli, Ted Bundy, Elizabeth Holmes, Bernie Madoff, they all share a common psychological architecture, not because they chose to be damaged, not because they were born monsters, but because a specific combination of traits, entitlement without empathy, charm without conscience, strategy without morality, creates a person who can do extraordinary damage in ordinary settings. The goal of understanding the Dark Triad isn't fear, it's clarity. When you can name the pattern, you can see it coming, and when you can see it coming, you have a choice. That's what mind crime is about, not sensationalizing the darkness, mapping it. Because the most dangerous thing about the Dark Triad isn't how rare it is, it's how common it is. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe. We publish every week. And if you want to go deeper, the next video examines one of the most documented Dark Triad cases in history. You already know his name.